All right. Well, we'll get going here. So these past few weeks, we've been going through diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dale, I learned that you had a good session last weekend on this.
Oh boy.
He was in continuing education, and I know I was at least a part of it.
Continuing indoctrination is what.
Continue. I like that. Continuing indoctrination. But it takes us a while to get through it because, a limited time, number one, and to understand where it's all coming from, you just have to dig a little bit. So we've talked about the Trojan horse, right? We talked about that the first week. Last week, I introduced that there's actually three different operating systems. Um, Linux being the other one that nobody uses. You have to be a super wizard to understand how to operate Linux, and but that's the operating system that we're dealing with. That's the part. That's the evil part of what DEI is. And so, if you weren't here last week, we'll get into that a little bit today, just to understand. So, what we did is we talked through the definition of diversity. We did the biblical definition, which is number one, which is what we ought to think of diversity, which is character driven, which is experience, talents, abilities, knowledge, personality. We talked about the other operating system, which is identity politics, which is not the right way to view diversity, which basically puts things like skin color and sexual orientation and race and culture and disability and class as the way to define what diversity means. And then we had the third, which is the Linux, which is you have to have the special knowledge, which is the critical consciousness added to identity politics, which comes from critical theory, having the correct politics and power dynamics. We talked about that last week. Today, we're going to get into inclusion. You might wonder why I skip equity, because I think they've got them in the wrong order. That's why. I credit Jordan Peterson. He did a speech a while back, and he said it should be diversity, inclusion, and equity, but then they would end up spelling die, which is what we'll all do if we follow their precepts. Probably. Okay, this article. This is going to be the it doesn't make sense portion of our lesson today. Harvard reserves performance of Black Macbeth exclusively for Black identifying audience members. This version of the play is called Macbeth in Stride. Sounds fun. You can read through that top paragraph, but the interesting part is that bottom paragraph. For our non-Black allies, we appreciate your support in making this a completely Black identifying evening. We invite you to join us at another performance during the run. They wanted this to be a complete blackout, is the term that they use in the first paragraph.
But it said the identifying Black.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's because they just like their ideology goes so far they can't even help themselves. Like if they don't say that, then this is how they get into the grand wizardry of the Linux operating system. Okay. So thinking of inclusion, you would think this doesn't make sense because they're not including everyone, they're actually excluding people. So how can inclusion become a form of exclusion? A couple of others, these were some things I found. If you read in here, like this one here, it says, this retreat is a Black, Indigenous, people of color space only. Only is all caps. This space is for BIPOC advocates and leaders to have a safe space to refresh, connect, and heal with others throughout the state working in the sexual violence field. Similar thing over here, consult group only for BIPOC. And you guys remember what BIPOC is, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. There's another way to say that.
No whites.
Yep. Okay. Inclusion. Once again, using DEI principles, we have an exclusion. Okay, this is the it doesn't make sense portion of today's lesson. So how does this inclusion make it make sense? Here's the definition. Inclusion refers to the practice of ensuring that all individuals, regardless of their background, abilities, or circumstances, have equal access to opportunities, resources, and participation in various aspects of society. This concept is often applied in contexts such as education, workplaces, and communities, aiming to create environments where diversity is valued and everyone feels welcomed and supported. Inclusion emphasizes respect, equity, and the removal of barriers that prevent full participation. Sounds like a fair definition, mostly. No, I don't, it's not the way I would do it, but this is a definition that I found. So let's talk about why I put it in order of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we should. Diversity is the definition. It attempts to answer the question of who is diverse. We talked about that last week. Okay? Inclusion is the policy. Okay, I've defined a bunch of people. I know what diverse is, but what does that mean? That doesn't do anything for me. I need now to add a policy which brings them into our space. And so now we bring them in. We include them as part of whatever it is we're in, any room that we're in, right? And then equity is actually the ultimate goal. That's what they're trying to get to. And we're going to talk about that next week. So I'm not going to dive into that too much this week, but that is actually their goal. And if you think about it through their lens, they're starting with the end in mind. So that's their goal. And diversity and equity in their definition are going to get us there. Biblical inclusion. We're going to talk scripture for a little bit here and talk about the church. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning and he came out to the temple. And all the people came to him and he sat down and he taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and he said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." All right. Question. Who do we let in our church door?
Anybody and everybody. Those that want to obey the Lord.
Has this church ever turned away anybody? You're not welcome here. In fact, I would be hard pressed to find, not even this church, any church that I'm aware of, to say you're not welcome here, regardless of denomination, is what I mean by that. So what is inclusivity from a church perspective? If I said that person that is coming in the door is a homosexual, does that mean they can't come in?
Well, we welcome them.
We welcome anybody. Is that not true? There's nobody that is ever going to be turned away. Now, there is going to be some expectation of decorum. We could turn somebody away if they're being, rambunctious or something that is causing trouble or trying to disrupt or trying to do something that is bad. But if they are coming to our door in seek of something, whatever they think that might be, we can give that truth to them. We're going to let them in, right?
I think from the principle of the matter, yes. But however, I think some people's actions speak very strongly against that stuff. Even though, yeah, come on in, but then we're not going to get anywhere around that person. So we did a experiment with a youth group. I spent probably 10 years ago. And we had a friend of mine, he dressed up homeless, and we were having a lock-in, and he showed up at the church and started knocking on the doors. And we let him in, and we just wanted to see how the kids reacted to it. Mm-hmm. And we had 2 of probably the 20 that were here go and tend to this person and see if they could help, and the others just acted like the person wasn't there. And I feel like that's very similar on some aspects of this, where certain groups of people, that if they were to come here or any other church for that matter, that you would have your small segment of the group reach out and try to bring those people in and make them feel at home. But the vast majority, I feel like we would have not.
And I would say that the percentages would probably be consistent for adults, even though you did this with a youth group. This is definitely something Dale should be talking about, not me. However, there is a level of uncomfortableness that people have. They don't know how to handle those types of situations. And so you have a small percentage of people that are even willing, and those are going to be your extroverts, and those are going to be those that have a temperament that is truly to seek others. Because I'm going to tell you, that's not going to be me. Like, I get very uncomfortable in those types of situations, and I don't personally even know how to react. So I mean, that's a very good experiment, and I'm not saying you're wrong at any, like, you're 100% right. However, as a general rule, they're welcome.
Certainly.
That's and
100%.
Yeah. Clint, did you have something?
Yeah, as a general rule, they're welcome to worship with us, be kind of among us, but they have to choose to stay. And part of staying is repentance, which mm-hmm. they would say means that they're not actually included, right? For some of these groups.
Certainly over time, they would start to have a sense of uncomfortableness amongst themselves because they're going to hear things and see things that are going to be, well, uncomfortable, right? And if they're in sin, and so they will hopefully self-select. But our job would be to say, you're welcome. We're all sinners. Like, we don't come to church because we're perfect. Like, we're all sinners. We've all sinned. We're here because we know we're sinners and we need help. We need Christ. And so that's the message for someone who's to come to the door. So biblically speaking, I'm trying to get in our head, once again, this is the 3 operating systems. Inclusion, that's what it's about. It has nothing to do with skin color or class. Like, inclusion is about who you are as a person, okay, and what do you bring to the table. We answered that, so I don't know why I had that extra question in there. Okay, so that's the way a church should react. Now, when we talk about society, we talk about education and workplace. That does change a little bit, okay? What does inclusion look like in society that's a little bit different? Because now we're not talking about like the soul. We're not talking about, salvation. We're talking more about like, hey, we're just going to live amongst people. They might not agree with me, but here's something I can do to include them. I'll give you the biggest one. Were you about to say something? Here's the biggest one right here. Does anybody, oh, come on in. Does anybody believe that giving special accommodations to those that are physically handicapped, or in some cases even mentally handicapped, or handicapped in any other way, is a bad thing? Like, I don't see any problem with it, especially in a society that we have the development that we have. I remember how many years ago it was. I want to say it's like 10 years ago. We built the elevator here in the building, and that was an accommodation. We have handicap parking spaces. Sometimes I might think there's too many of them, but there's nothing that is wrong with the inclusion of somebody who can't get around the way that we can get around. If they need extra space to get their handicap wheelchair, the van, so they need extra space, like, give them big space. I got no problem with that. Put them right in the front. I think that's fantastic. There are instances where this starts to go a little bit too far. We're not going to get into that. But my general point here is that in society, we do have an inclusion policy that we all agree upon, that we all think is good. as a Christian, I should be for including these types of people. Here's another one that's a little bit more contentious. So go ahead.
Why did you use the retrograde handicap icon?
The what?
Well, that was replaced with the racy one.
Oh, I don't know. You have to ask Google. I just pulled up an image and threw it in there. I didn't know that there was a new one.
Oh yeah. It's the guy's leaning forward and he's like racing his.
Oh, he's fast. Yeah. And how do you know it's a he?
Well, I'm assuming.
Oh, you shouldn't
Wow.
do that.
Well, it could be he, but he may not identify.
Yeah.
So here's another thing of inclusion, and this one's a little bit more contentious, and I'm going to put myself on the line because my wife is a teacher, and this is we have inclusion for special education kids in our schools. This one is I'm a little bit more like on the teeter-totter, and I'll tell you why. Because I believe wholeheartedly that special education kids ought to be able to socialize with other kids. I absolutely believe that. I also believe that kids that don't need special education shouldn't be held back because they have a special education kid in their classroom. So it's a very difficult situation. I hear it all the time with Rachel coming home because she has, what do you have, 3 SPED kids in your class this year? 4 SPED kids? SPED is special education. So it's a challenge, and she comes home because those kids are definitely a challenge. And sometimes what I'm hearing is, oh, so the kids that don't need it are not getting the full instruction that they need because you're having to go deal with somebody who's doing whatever. And I've heard all kinds of crazy stories. But I'm also not saying that you shouldn't just put them in an isolation room and never put them amongst other kids, because I get that they need to have some sort of socialization. That's part of their education. So once again, I have my thoughts on this. Anybody else have thoughts that they want to put out online? Okay.
I do agree. My sister's also a teacher, and her class is often disrupted because there's children in there that need more attention than what your average teacher can do when they have a classroom of 20 people.
Yeah.
And then the lessons don't move forward
Right.
because of having to,
Yep.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and so I have sympathy for those that are trying to create that right balance. So I do believe there are appropriate and useful approaches to inclusion. So this is not inclusion is a bad word. We have a biblical reason to like it. We have some societal reasons to be inclusive to other people that we ought to be. But does it go too far? Okay. So when we get into diversity and inclusion, what I want you to see here is these things are linked. You have to have one to have the other. And what I mean that I'm talking about the way that it's being used in DEI. Diversity comes along with inclusion. Inclusion comes along with diversity. They're one and one. They do different things. They perform different tasks, but they are linked. So why am I saying that? We had our 3 definitions we did last week. Well, inclusion has the exact same definitions. So what does it mean if you have a diversity that you're character driven and your experience? What does the inclusion look like, and what is it that you're measuring inclusion against? And by the way, I'm being very simplified, so I'm not going to get into all these words. I'm going to be very simplified, very straightforward. That is basically a merit-based type of inclusion. Really easy example. If the NBA wanted to be really, really inclusive, they would let me play for them. Right? Am I qualified in any possible way to go play in the NBA? Not even. Nope, don't even give it to, no, 0. So the reason that you get to the NBA is merit-based, and it should be, always. It is how good you are, and it should be that way with almost every other environment. I can't just go do what I want to do because I want to go do it. I can't just be included. It's just not how it works. And so if you're going to think of inclusivity on a basis that is fair to everybody, it would be on merit. And yes, that also means some people aren't going to get to do what they want to do. And that is okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. We just have to accept it. Identity politics. Well, it's in the word, identity. I'm included because of my identity. Okay? But then we have the special super secret club of the identity politics plus critical consciousness. And inclusion requires critical consciousness. Okay? Hopefully, we're going to work through this. You guys just the light bulbs go off as to why you can now have a black only group that excludes anybody else. It's that third definition. So what is this critical consciousness? We've talked about it in the past, but I want to really hammer it home. This is National Library of Medicine. This is a brief that was a paper, an academic paper. It might be hard for you to read, so I'll read it here. Part of the abstract, the introduction, recognizing the need to teach concepts of health equity, diversity, and inclusion as part of medical students' preclinical training. We developed a series of workshops in the first year of medical school that introduce students to issues of discrimination and inequity in their effects on healthcare. The student-led, faculty-supported project, faculty-supported, who's teaching who, project known as Critical Consciousness in Medicine, adopted critical consciousness as a guiding principle for student learning. Somebody was in school, they were going, who was that? Was that a few weeks ago when they were talking about it? They were in like nursing school and they had to go to, and you've said you've done this yourself. Yeah, somebody Harding. I'm trying to remember who it was. Oh, yes. Isabel Dees, yeah. Oh, this is where it shows up here, but not for me. Okay, so a little media for you today. We're going to watch a 3-minute movie. This is explaining, hopefully the volume's turned up enough.
Dr. Hooker, an awful lot of what you wanted to create space for, facilitate, welcome young people into is the development of critical consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I guess as we anticipate folks watching this around the world, we should just pause to unpack what you mean by critical consciousness.
Mm-hmm. There's a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, and he has this wonderful expression, which is, it goes without saying because it came without saying, which is that much of what we inherit, many of the structures that we inherit, the inequities, the hierarchies, the exclusions that are built into them don't have to be taught. We experience them, we live into them, they become the water in which we live. A critical consciousness gives us the capacity to analyze, to notice, and to navigate those in ways that begin to open up, to deconstruct, and to challenge, and believe that the systems can be different, that our hierarchies can be deconstructed. And so we need a set of skills and a framework. Like, how do we know from the margins who's allowed to be in this space? How do we know when we're privileged and others are not? We almost always recognize when we're being oppressed, but never know when we're being privileged towards someone else's oppression. And so the necessity of critical consciousness as an aspect, as a vital, fundamental even aspect of the performance of Christianity is to say that this is supposed to deconstruct hierarchy. This is supposed to deconstruct all the places of exclusion. And we need to have the practices associated with it. We need to have a framework associated with it. And so Paulo Freire, the brilliant Brazilian education specialist and liberation education specialist, in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, describes conscientization, like how do we use the arts and theater as a methodology to allow us to explore some of these places that we otherwise would want to challenge. How do we name those challenges and then use engagement, particularly for youth, in art and language and poetry, and using slam poetry and music as a way of investigating and analyzing these different exclusions and hierarchies that they would otherwise not support. And so you're giving them and creating the opportunities, particularly in those youth ministry spaces, where they're not compelled to listen to the adult, when the adults don't get to determine the standard for understanding. There's not a imposed narrative. They get to explore and question and deconstruct and then use art and creativity and body movement and so forth as ways of doing it, so that they recognize that the performance, the way of being Christian, actually requires a critical consciousness and understanding an untransformed or a transformed mind that doesn't necessarily align with the narratives of the world.
That was English, but I didn't understand anything he said.
Well, I'm hoping you can start to understand it, because I'm trying to unpack some of these words. The reason I picked that one was he was specifically bringing in the Christian aspect of this, and he's basically saying that the transforming of your mind, as we read about in Scripture, is this critical consciousness. So if you don't think that they're coming after us in the churches and trying to get us to and manipulate our minds using biblical terms such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and equity is a challenging one for me, but they're absolutely doing so. Did you pick up on some of the other words that he was using there? Deconstruct.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember when we talked about constructivism? Social constructs. Everything's a social construct, therefore nothing's real. Marriage is a social construct. Race is a social construct. Property ownership is a social construct. He's talking about deconstructing all of that. And this Paulo Freire, I've shown this to you before because I still have it in here. I have his book right in here, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Paul is a Marxist. He's not secret about it. He's an actual, he's a Marxist. So this guy's praising him. And so go ahead, Clint.
There's a huge deconstruction movement within Christianity as well. It's the word that they use when people fall away from the faith. They've deconstructed their faith. So I think he's also using that is implied in what he's talking about here too. That all of these structures in the government, in our economy, within the church, you need to deconstruct all of those things. And then you can use art and things like that to reconstruct something else.
You become enlightened.
You become enlightened. And there's a reason he chose the arts in that thing, because those are, you get...
This is all Gnosticism. It's absolutely the same thing that they were dealing with in Greece.
Yes.
And Paul's done it. It's no different.
It is a Gnostic religion, yes. Yeah. That's what Marxism is. That was going to be my concluding class. That's going to be my concluding class, and we're going to talk about that.
Sorry about that.
No. Once again, I like when you say these things because it validates when we get to it, we talk about it. Because I said at the very beginning that I was going to prove to you that Marxism isn't just this economic theory. It is a cult religion, and it is coming after Christianity. And that is why it is important for us to have open eyes and to be able to discern when we see it. I had another little video. I'm going to skip it, though.
Critical pedagogy is a teaching approach.
Because we don't have time. There's a really good one, though. Just going to tell you more about critical pedagogy because how are they teaching kids, and he's going to talk about it. But we'll probably do it when we're going to do a class on education, so we understand what they're doing in the education field. The goal of inclusion with a critical consciousness is to transfer power and remove oppression. That is the difference between just inclusion and, hey, I've got people here that are diverse. Critical inclusivity means not only do I have a group of people that are diverse, I have to get rid of any power structure that might exist in this room. That's how you can say, we're going to have a blackout, black only, that are going to come and watch the show. That is inclusive in their mind because to think of it critically, they're removing the power structure. Okay? Remember we had this wheel? This wheel, they're trying to invert it. And so anybody in the middle, right, they have to be taken out to the exterior. The people out here is what they would say are on the margins. They're the people that are all oppressed. And by the way, some of these things are physical characteristics, and some of these things are behavioral. And where do they get the behavioral oppression from? They're sexual deviance. What speaks against sexual deviance? Christianity. So Christianity is responsible for many of these things that they say are part of the oppressed. So they are absolutely coming after Christianity, as well as physical, body size. So critical inclusivity, special wizardry, this is the Linux operating system, says you cannot even be in the room. We have to get rid of it. And so like when you think of a country or a society, that's what they're trying to do. So what is inclusion with critical consciousness responsible for? There's a lot of things. I'm going to cover just a few. The first one that they got us on because we didn't see it coming was gay marriage. Gay marriage is 100% an inclusivity type of a model. Why? Because why does your marriage between a man and a wife have to exclude people that like people that are gay? That's how they got it. And too many Christians fell for it. And eventually, over time, like, back, I don't know what years, but over time, and then finally in the 90s, it started to get to 50%. And then all of a sudden now, I don't know what it is, 70% of America agrees with gay marriage. Pronouns. This idea that we get to own language surrounding ourselves, and in Canada, and in other places too, I think even England, it is illegal. Garrett was talking this morning about we don't have laws that require us to go against God's word. If we don't hit this now, this is coming to us. We will end up being arrested if you will not be subjected to somebody else's pronouns. It's absolutely coming. And this is a inclusivity initiative. It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but here's what I can tell you. The entire thing is intended to confuse. It's intended to create chaos. They want chaos. It's all about fluidity, and it's ridiculous. There's a lot going on now about trans youth and what we're doing to teenagers and mutilating their bodies, giving them hormone blockers and chemicals that castrate them, and it's unbelievable. And that is done out of the inclusivity language. That's what's happening. You can't say no to them because trans people are oppressed. And if they're oppressed, they get to have a seat at the table. And so who's to tell you that you can't tell a 13-year-old that they're not a boy or a girl that's opposite of what they were born? Okay? So that's the same thing. So this is responsible for that. I love this one. Lutheran pastor hosts drag Bible study classes for children at woke Chicago church. We're putting men who just say that they're women in women's prisons. I bet you can guess what happens next. It doesn't take rocket surgery. And then this is one that's also out there, and listen, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm also not walking around saying that I'm super healthy either. But this is what inclusivity does. It's trying to create chaos and reframe the brain. So really quickly, we're going to end on this. I talked about belonging, and then because we're going to move on to equity. Belonging is a word that's often either added to or used in place of inclusion. What is it? And remember, we talked about some of our Christian colleges use belonging instead. So Lipscomb does it. Abilene Christian does it. Office of Engagement and Belonging. So I have another little short video. This is also like two and a half minutes of James Lindsay explaining what belonging is, because he can do it way better than I can.
That's where we turn to belonging. Belonging is inclusion on steroids. It's a fancy buzzword. University of Oklahoma, or Oklahoma University president recently, I spoke with him when I was in Oklahoma recently, and he talked to me and said, we wanted to have my whole little spill, and I said, you're basically bringing neo-Marxism into your university under the guise of diversity, equity, inclusion. I read your entire strategic plan. I read the separate document that's the diversity, equity, inclusion plan that you didn't include in the same document, so there's an extra piece of legwork to go find out what you're really implementing. And I'm telling you, it's a catastrophe. You're bringing neo-Marxism and identity politics onto campus. And I give my whole little spill, and he listened. He was very engaged. I don't want to make it like he was dismissive of me. And then he turned into a politician the second it was his turn to talk, and he said, well, it's really just about making sure that all students have a feeling of belonging. And I said, listen, you can't use that word belonging with me and think I don't know what it means. And all of a sudden, we had a real conversation after that, which was great. Belonging means that you actually have to make somebody who's been included. So remember, diversity is not enough. You have to make people feel included. But belonging is that you have to go the further step of making the person that you've now included feel like they belong. Like they were an intentional, hyper-welcomed member of whatever it happens to be, that they belong, that their ideas belong, etc. And so when you look at this through that lens of power dynamics, it's absolutely impossible to disagree with somebody who's putting out some crackpot idea if they happen to be of a particular category of a protected class, a certain race or whatever. You cannot disagree with them because they don't feel like they belong anymore. Maybe they don't have great ideas. So it's literally tipping the scale where I've mentioned, the addiction medicine and the idea of enablement. It's literally tipping the scale into enablement. It actually calls for, in the definition of belonging, positive celebration of the contributions of the included party. Whatever they say is great. That feminist painting, instead of a glacier photograph from satellite.
There he goes a little bit into something else for just a couple more seconds, so I'm just going to skip along. You get the point. Belonging is this idea that, okay, I brought you in the room. Now we're all in the room together. That's inclusion. Now I have to go a step further, and everything that you say and believe is valid because it's your truth. So they use these words like my lived experience, which is another way of saying my truth, which is a postmodernist take with neo-Marxism built into it. And basically it's saying that is more important than the truth. So they'll say things like my lived experience. I have a lived experience too, but that doesn't mean that my lived experience has anything to do with you. They manipulate that. And so, well, are you saying that I didn't experience that? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it doesn't matter because there is a truth whether or not you experience something or not. That's the difference. So that's where belonging is actually a little bit more, and it's even more sinister because the word belonging feels so welcoming. Like, who doesn't want to be belong? Like, everybody wants to belong to something. You don't want anybody to feel not belonging to a group. So we'll end on this. Romans 5. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare to even die. But God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The point there is inclusion is, scripturally speaking, for everyone in this context only. Getting into this whole other idea, this neo-Marxist critically conscious aspect of it is, I'm going to go back and say it again, it is the spirit of Cain. It is evil, and we need to identify it as evil, and it's coming after us, and we have to be able to recognize it and see it. I remember, I'm going to close because I know the second bell rang. Last spring, Matt came in here and he showed that video, or maybe you didn't show it, maybe you just talked about it. The He Gets Us, and it was the Super Bowl one. Remember? Did we talk about it, or did you show it? You talked about it, and you even pointed to me, Ryan, what do you think about this? And I was like, well, it's evil. And I said that, and I think a lot of people in the room were like, how is that evil? And this is the thing this is what I'm seeing. That He Gets Us campaign is using this critical consciousness to try to identify how Christians ought to act and ought to be. That's why I called it evil at that time. So anyway, all right, we've gone way too long. Thank you guys, appreciate it.